Balls, balls, balls. Wide receivers, let's see a lot of balls. Wide receivers that catch a lot of balls. Wide receivers that even drop a lot of balls. Okay, I think you get the point about today's video. But if I keep saying balls too much more often, this video is going to start being recommended to everybody searching for the Diddy trials. Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? Today is part 2 of my volume versus efficiency series that I do every single offseason. And yesterday's video was all about volume and running backs. And if you missed that video, there will be a link in the description down below, and it will be recommended at the end of this video as well. However, today is all about wide receivers, and there are going to be a ton of names on the screen. I'm taking a look at the top 40 wide receivers in terms of targets last season. And then we're going to be diving deep into a bunch of other volume categories to go along with it. Now, why so many wide receivers? There were some guys that missed time last year, and because of that, their names were a little bit lower on the list. And I really felt like if we didn't include them, I was going to get a ton of questions about it. So I wanted to nip it in the bud, and I figured we're just going to go a little bit deeper in this video than we've ever gone before. Now, if you're not familiar with this video series, this is the 4th year in the offseason that I have done this. And essentially what I do is I take the top players in terms of volume at their positions for running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. And I do a video for each position based on volume alone. And then the week after that, I start to dive into the efficiency of each of those running backs. So then we really start to paint a picture of who has a ton of volume but not a lot of efficiency, who doesn't have a ton of volume but has a lot of efficiency and maybe is the next breakout star if they do get that volume. What are some guys that we should pass on? Who are some guys that we have to draft no matter what? These are a lot of questions that are answered during these videos. So if you're new here, subscribe to the channel. If you're new or returning and your bell notifications are not on, turn them on right now so you don't miss one of these videos, because this is a really important series and one of the most popular series of videos we do every single offseason. And if you're looking for a little bit more of an edge over your competition this season, our 2025 Fantasy Football Draft Guide is exactly the way to do it. It is already open and chock full of tons of rookie and dynasty information. By the end of next week, I will have a scouting report for every single rookie that was drafted this past season. Quarterbacks, running backs, and wide receivers are already done. I'm working on tight ends right now, wrapping them up. But for you redraft guys out there or gals, that will be available very, very soon. This draft guide updates all off season long. And whenever there's breaking news or information that is going to be updated, the draft guide will update with it. It is never going to go out of date. It is never going to leave you behind your competition, and it is going to have you ready to win fantasy championships and redraft, dynasty, keeper, best ball, guillotine. It doesn't matter. Any type of league that you can think of. Make sure that you get yours right now and start getting ready to dominate in 2025. But it's time to jump into all of the information, and I've got 8 different wide receiver categories based on just volume that we're going to be discussing today, and we're going to kick it off with targets. And again, I've got the top 40 wide receivers on this list. So there are going to be a ton of names on the screen at any given time. Let me go through each one of them when we talk about targets, and then as we move forward, I may only talk about certain players here and there. We are not going to have enough time to talk about all 40. Guys that absolutely dominated targets last year: Jamar Chase, Malik Neighbors, Garrett Wilson, even with a down performance, still saw a ton of targets. Justin Jefferson, Drake London, CeeDee Lamb, Jerry Jeudy, which might be a little surprising to some of you, Amon-Ra St. Brown, DJ Moore, Devontae Adams put us inside the top 10 in terms of targets last season. Now we know Devontae Adams, he's going to be with Matthew Stafford and the Rams this year. That could end up being good for him in terms of more volume going forward. A guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown, I don't think he's going to be affected by the change in his offensive coordinator. DJ Moore might have a little bit more competition for targets. Jerry Jeudy, what is his situation going to look like there in Cleveland? CeeDee Lamb, Yes, they have George Pickens. Maybe his volume is affected a little bit, but I don't think enough to really be worried about it. Drake London, Justin Jefferson, Garrett Wilson, Malik Neighbors, Jamar Chase, all of these guys, in my opinion, are still going to be in a very solid position to see a lot of targets moving forward. Moving on to the next 10, going through 11 through 20. JSN, what are we going to have with him now that they've added Cooper Kupp, but they got rid of DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett? Cortland Sutton, Wan'Dale Robinson, 132 targets last season. I really feel like Wan'Dale Robinson isn't going to get that this year. And that's going to be a whole offseason of videos to come about the New York Giants offense. Maybe he does, and with a more competent quarterback, maybe he has some bigger plays. But really, Wan'Dale Robinson's just a PPR guy. Brian Thomas Jr., even with Travis Hunter there now, 129 targets. I really don't see how he doesn't at least add to that a little bit. Even if it's still less than 150, how he doesn't add another 10 to 15 targets at least. Jacoby Myers could be in line for a decent amount of targets with Geno. Tyreek Hill, obviously, he was banged up last season and he was missing Tua. If Tua could stay healthy, Tyreek Hill goes way up on this board. If he's not, it's a big issue. Keenan Allen doesn't even have a team right now. Terry McLaurin had a huge season last year, and I feel like people are already knocking him down because of Deebo Samuel. But do we really think that he's going to have less than 115 targets like he did last season? I don't think so, and he does a lot with those targets. That's going to come up in the efficiency video more than volume, but just look at that, 115 targets, and he was still a huge playmaker last season. Marvin Harrison Jr., I mean, we need to see those targets increase for the sake of that Arizona offense. And Calvin Ridley with Cam Ward there, maybe the targets get a little bit better, but I wouldn't be shocked if he's still a guy that's a little bit up and down. Going 21 through 30 now. Zay Flowers, they've added DeAndre Hopkins. I don't know if that hurts him all that much. Juwan Jennings could have a bigger role this year. How good is Brandon Ayuk going to be for the start of the season? Will he be 100%? Will it take some time? Will a guy like Ricky Pearsall step up? Deebo Samuel going away will add a few targets though. Ladd McConkey, I could see him improving on his 110 targets. DK Metcalf with 108. Even if he gets 100 targets again this season, are they going to be quality targets? Mike Evans with 107. I don't really see that number going up all that much. They've added Emeka Egbuka. Chris Godwin could end up being back. Michael Pittman Jr., T. Higgins, he missed some times last year. If he can stay healthy this year, 104 targets, should be well over that too. Back to Michael Pittman. Michael Pittman is a guy, he does have a lot of players around him. He's not somebody I feel like takes a huge step forward. Puka Nacua is going to be in a situation where he lost Cooper Kupp, but he has Devontae Adams. Should still see a little bit more than 103 targets. Josh Downs at 100, George Pickens at 100. Both of those seem like decent numbers that they could end up seeing again. Even though they've got a lot of guys around them, we're not really adding to the numbers that they saw last year. Let's round out the last several here, 31 through 40. Nico Collins, he missed time. That number would have been way higher. Cooper Kupp, he was banged up last year. If he's fully healthy, that number goes higher. Rome Odunze, you have to hope that number goes higher with no Keenan Allen, but what does Colston Loveland bring to the table? A.J. Brown, he is a guy definitely banged up last year. If he's healthy, over 100 targets, but Devontae Smith is right there behind him at 84 targets. Both of those guys could go over 100 this season. Khalil Shakir, would love to see him get more targets in this Buffalo offense. He got better and better as the year went on. Xavier Worthy, it's really going to depend on Rashee Rice's health and whether or not he can reach the 100 target mark this year. Jordan Addison with Justin Jefferson there, about 100 targets is really going to be realistic for him. Jamison Williams, 88 targets, probably stays about the same. He's going to be a guy that's going to be very similar to like a Terry McLaurin. Terry McLaurin might not see a big jump in targets, but he's so efficient with the targets he does get that he is still a guy that is fantasy worthy. I like Terry McLaurin way more than I like Jamison Williams. Let me just point that out. But J-Mo and his big playability in that offense isn't going to go anywhere. And Demario Douglas, last guy to talk about here. He was a guy that was up and down, did miss a couple of games. For me personally with Demario Douglas, now that they've added weapons in that offense like Stephon Diggs, I'm not as keen to him as being really the safety blanket that he was last season, but maybe he can still take that step forward. All right, now let's talk about the guys that did the most with the targets they received. So I'm going to be talking about receptions at this point, but really cross-examining where they ended up when we were looking at the targets as well. So Ja'Marr Chase, most targets, most receptions. Amon-Ra St. Brown, 8th in targets, 2nd in receptions. That's a big jump, and I absolutely love it. The connection between him and Jared Goff has been talked about extensively over the last couple of years. That's not going to change anytime soon. Malik Neighbors goes from 2 in targets to 3 in receptions. JJ is 4 and 4. Garrett Wilson was 3 in targets and 5th in receptions. Even with subpar quarterback play, with the amount of targets he was getting, he was still hauling a lot of them in. CeeDee Lamb, 6, tied for 5th in receptions. Drake London was 5th in targets, 7th in receptions. JSN is another guy that makes a positive jump. 11th in targets, up to 7th in receptions, doing a little bit more, even though he was outside the top 10 in terms of targets. Even if his targets maybe take a little bit of a hit with a guy like with a guy like Cooper Kupp being there now, it will be interesting to see if Sam Darnold and JSN have that same connection that he did with Geno Smith. DJ Moore, 9th in targets, 9th in receptions. Wan'Dale Robinson, 12th in targets, 10th in receptions. We'll see here in a couple of minutes, though, why those numbers are great, but it wasn't enough last season to really call him a consistent fantasy contributor. Now a guy that's taking a little bit of a step back, Jerry Jeudy, 142 targets, which was 7th, all the way down to 11th in receptions. Will improved quarterback play this year be something that helps Jerry Jeudy out? Brian Thomas Jr., pretty even across the board. 14th in targets, 12th in receptions. Taking a look at other guys that have seen like a big positive or a big negative jump. What about a guy like Ladd McConkey? 23rd in targets, all the way up to 15th in reception. So once again, doing a whole lot more with a whole lot less. And if those targets can go up a little bit more this year, then we're definitely going to see an opportunity to see his receptions go up as well. McConkey and Justin Herbert are absolutely on the same page. Khalil Shakir, another guy with a positive jump from targets to receptions. 95 targets, which was tied for 34th. He jumps up to 21st with 76 receptions. Love to see that positive jump. Now, here is an interesting question to ask about the Chicago Bears offense, Caleb Williams in particular. Is he going to take a step forward under Ben Johnson, and will this offense make him much more successful? DJ Moore in these categories was fine last year. Already talked about it. 9th in targets, 9th in receptions. However, both Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze for Chicago last year saw a negative drop when it came to targets to receptions, because Keenan Allen was 17th in targets, but he dropped to 26 in receptions, while Rome Odunze was 33rd in targets, but dropped to 40th in receptions. We're going to need to see a positive climb, especially for Rome Odunze this year. Keenan Allen, obviously a free agent. He's not going back to Chicago, so I'm not worried about that. Rome Odunze hopefully picks up some of those targets, but hopefully we see some better outcomes with the targets, because that negative drop is something that Caleb Williams is going to have to work with his receivers on. All right, now we're taking a look at receiving yards. And the one thing I don't want to dive too much into is yards per reception, because that's going to be coming up in the efficiency video, which will be next week. However, when I take a look at receiving yards, I am still interested in seeing, was there a positive correlation across the board, or were there negative drops, just like we saw from targets to receptions? Is there a drop from targets to receptions to receiving yards? And that's what we're going to talk about here for a moment when we go through all this. Ja'Marr Chase, obviously at the top of the list. Brian Thomas Jr. was the biggest positive gain here, because he went from 14th in targets to 12th in receptions to 3rd in receiving yards. So we saw the big playability absolutely on point with Trevor Lawrence or Mac Jones at all points last season. He's the biggest gainer. Another guy that had a lot of the biggest positive gains as well was Ladd McConkey. 23rd in targets, 15th in receptions, up to 9th in receiving yards. Another guy that continued to take those steps forward. A little bit of a negative drop here that we could see from a couple of guys. We see a guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown, 2nd in receptions to 5th in receiving yards. Still 1,200 receiving yards. Not too worried about something like that. Malik Neighbors drops a little bit, third in receptions to 7th in receiving yards. CeeDee Lamb just drops a couple of spots from 5 to 8. And then we got Jackson Smith and Jigba, and Garrett Wilson was one of the bigger fallers, one of the bigger negative drops when it came to receptions, tied for 5th in receptions, down to 11th in receiving yards. So not the biggest concerns, but another one of the big gainers that we saw here, A.J. Brown, 30th in receptions, jumps all the way up to 14th in receiving yards. So even with the limited games last season where he did miss time, he was still a big play threat every single time that he stepped on the field. A big gainer is Calvin Ridley, 34th in receptions, but 18th in receiving yards. Cam Ward could really help him kind of get back on track to what we saw a couple of years ago. Now, the biggest negative drop here that we could find, and there were 2 of them. Number 1 being DJ Moore. He goes from 9th in targets, 9th in receptions, to 25th in receiving yards. He was top 10 in targets and receptions, but didn't even crack 1,000 receiving yards last season. Again, part of this Ben Johnson offense that we're going to have to see move forward, and we're going to have to see really improve Caleb Williams and the efficiency of the entire offense. Another guy that dropped quite a bit was Wan'Dale Robinson, and this isn't really that surprising. Last year when we would do start and sit and rankings videos, people would say all the time, where's Wan'Dale Robinson? Why isn't he in here? I feel like we have to start him. We didn't have to. If you were in a PPR league, he was a decent flex option. He goes from 12th in targets, 10th in receptions, to 38th in receiving yards. He didn't even break 700 receiving yards last season. That is absolutely insane to see that. Guys that had less than 93 receptions that broke 700 receiving yards is really everybody above him at this point. 93 receptions. The only guy that beat that really was DJ Moore. He had 98 receptions, but he had 966 receiving yards. Absolutely insane. Absolutely insane that he didn't have more receiving yards than that. We'll see if that improves this year, but that is a big negative drop that doesn't make Wan'Dale Robinson a must start or even a must draft player. Let's dive into receiving touchdowns now. Which guys scored the most last season? And we already know number 1 is Ja'Marr Chase, the Triple Crown winner for wide receivers last year. Targets, receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns, and he's going to be at the top of the list of a lot of these other categories as well. Not to play spoiler, but I think you probably already knew that. Terry McLaurin, I already mentioned him. This is a guy that goes from 15th in receptions all the way up to 2nd in receiving touchdowns. And a lot of people might look at that and say, that's not sustainable. There's no way that he can continue to do that. Me personally, now that you've added Deebo Samuel, you have Jaden Daniels who can run the football. Your run game isn't all that bad with Brian Robinson. Terry McLaurin is a deep threat, a guy that can consistently win down the field, especially in one-on-one coverage. And with Deebo being there now, safeties are going to have to keep an eye on him. So cornerbacks may not get help over the top like they used to. Terry McLaurin, to me, do I think he scores 13 receiving touchdowns again? Maybe not, but I don't think he sees such a dramatic drop that we're just fading Terry McLaurin. He's still one of my favorite picks of this offseason. Amon-Ra St. Brown with 12. He's way up there. Mike Evans with a huge jump. 22nd in receptions, up to 4th in receiving touchdowns. Justin Jefferson, top 5 across the board and basically everything at this point. Then you take a look at guys like Brian Thomas Jr. Again, not a ton of receptions, only 87 last year, but he was 3rd in receiving yards and now he's tied for 5th in receiving touchdowns. Same thing goes for T. Higgins. T. Higgins, who was 27th in receiving yards, 24th in receptions, 27th in targets, still scored 10 touchdowns. And if this is a guy that is on the field for all 17 games this season, now that he has himself his contract for the year, double-digit touchdowns absolutely in play. And as a guy that we're playing every single week, even if Ja'Marr Chase is getting a ton of targets to go to pull some of those away from T. Higgins. So for me personally, T. Higgins to me is a touchdown-dependent play, but not a bad touchdown-dependent play. Another guy that makes a pretty big positive jump, Jordan Addison. He goes from 30th 35th in receptions, up to 8th in receiving touchdowns. That's something that could still hold true with J.J. McCarthy this year. And then we see it again, too, with some of the guys coming up here. We see 17th in receptions for Courtland Sutton, tied for 10th in receiving touchdowns. Devontae Adams tied here as well. 14th in receptions. Marvin Harrison Jr., 36th in receptions. Devontae Smith, 28 in receptions. So a lot of these guys, big touchdown playmakers. Marvin Harrison Jr., 8 receiving touchdowns, tied for the top 10. He needs more targets. We need to get him more targets this season. Him and Kyler Murray, hopefully they've been working together over the offseason because those two need to get on track. Malik Neighbors is one of the guys that saw one of the biggest fall backwards. So guys that saw a lot of receptions but didn't see a ton of touchdowns. So let's highlight some of those guys real quick. A few guys that were top 10 in terms of receptions, but obviously outside the top 10 here with receiving touchdowns. Malik Neighbors, one of those guys. He takes a drop back, only 7 touchdowns on 109 receptions. Garrett Wilson, 7 touchdowns on 101 receptions. CeeDee Lamb, 6 touchdowns on 101 receptions. JSN, 6 touchdowns on 100 receptions. DJ Moore, 6 touchdowns on 98 receptions. DJ Moore was 9th in receptions. JSN was 7th. CeeDee Lamb was 5th. Garrett Wilson was tied for 5th. Malik Neighbors was 3rd. Those are the guys that, while from a fantasy standpoint, we saw a lot of volume, a lot of receptions, receiving yards, all of that, which was great. Touchdowns are really what kept them from being high upside plays a little bit more consistently. And really, if we can get some more of those touchdowns this year, we're going to see some pretty big jumps. Now, the guys that probably have the best outcome available to them would be Malik Neighbors. He's going to have a much better option at the quarterback position this year. Garrett Wilson, as of right now with Justin Fields, the hope is that there's a little bit of a better connection there, but I don't know if Justin Fields just automatically translate into more receiving touchdowns for Garrett Wilson. CeeDee Lamb, Dak Prescott being healthy for the entire year, and adding George Pickens, maybe we see a little bit of a drop in volume. Not enough to be concerned, but maybe it helps with the touchdowns. JSN, can him and Sam Darnold get on the same page? That's going to be the biggest question mark there. And DJ Moore, same quarterback, but new offensive coordinator. I decided to add drops as a category this season because I do think it is something that we should factor into making our decisions. But one thing that we need to always keep in mind is that when it comes to drops, it doesn't necessarily mean that wide receivers are awful, because the more targets you have, the more drops you could likely have as well. So let's check here real quick and see some correlation between targets and drops. There are a few guys that I want to highlight that were outside the top 30 in terms of targets last year, but unfortunately saw quite a bit of drops last season as well. Devontae Smith, 84 targets, which was tied for 40th. He had 4 drops last year, which was tied for 17th. Nico Collins, in the same boat, 99 targets last year, which was 31st, also 4 drops. A little bit of a bigger concern becomes Rome Odunze, who was 33rd in targets last year, and he had 5 drops on those 33 targets. And then George Pickens, who was 30th in targets last year with 100 targets, had 9 drops last season. Those are the things that are going to have to be cleaned up. When you take a look at a guy at the bottom of the list like CeeDee Lamb with 11 drops, he was 6th in targets. Jerry Jeudy had 10 drops. He was 7th in targets. Devontae Adams was 10th in targets with 10 drops. Courtland Sutton was 12th with 10 drops. Jamar Chase was 1st with 10 drops as well. So those drops, the more targets you get, unfortunately, yes, you're going to potentially have more drops. So sometimes we have to kind of take those things with a grain of salt. Now, when we take a look at it from the opposite direction, a guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown, who was 8th in targets and only had 1 drop all last season. That's pretty ridiculous. A guy like JSN, 11th in targets, only 2 drops last season. DJ Moore, for as concerned as I am about the receiving yards and the touchdowns, the guy catches things coming his way. 9th in targets last year, only 3 drops. So while we talk about some of the negatives of guys that don't see a ton of volume but had a whole lot of drops, there's also a few guys that see a lot of volume but didn't have nearly as many drops. And those guys are definitely ones that we need to be targeting because those are guys that we're going to be able to count on consistently. The last three categories we're going to talk about real quick are all about red zone targets, receptions, and touchdowns. And while I think we do need to include this in some of the things that we're talking about, we're using it to paint a picture and we're not making decisions solely based on this. So we're not going to spend nearly as much time talking about this, but I want to talk about the guys that are really good red zone targets that could continue to be moving forward. And a guy like Drake London at number 2, he saw a pretty big jump in terms of his overall volume last year, but to see he is utilized such as a heavy red zone target is really, really good for his touchdown potential, especially considering the fact he only had 9 receiving touchdowns last year. We need to get those pushed up because all 9 of those ended up being red zone touchdowns. So those came with inside the 20. And then you see a guy like Courtland Sutton. He could be a really good red zone threat. People don't talk about Amon-Ra St. Brown in the red zone nearly enough, but that is a guy that was 5th in red zone targets last season. Tyreek Hill was looked at quite a bit in the red zone as well. Devontae Adams, T. Higgins, and Garrett Wilson. Now, when you take a look at the bottom of the list, a guy like DK Metcalf, really feel like he should be utilized more in the red zone, and maybe he will be in Pittsburgh, but we don't even really know who his quarterback is going to be. And I say this with every video. By the time this comes out, maybe Aaron Rodgers has signed with them, but still no word at this point. But like, Puka Nacua, not really that big of a red zone threat. Maybe a little bit more this year, but I think Devontae Adams, who, when you go all the way up, was 6 or tied for 6 in red zone targets, he might be a better red zone weapon than what Puka Nacua could be this year. Wan'Dale Robinson isn't. Zay Flowers isn't. Cooper Kupp really isn't. Michael Pittman, I really feel like he should be looked at in the red zone more often. We could probably say more about the quarterback play at that point than Michael Pittman. Ladd McConkey, Khalil Shakir, Demario Douglas, all these guys are not really red zone threats. Same could be said for like Jameson Williams, Devontae Smith. A.J. Brown, to me, should be a little bit higher. He should be looked at in the red zone a whole lot more, but we know that they run the football and they punch it in from the goal line quite a bit with either Jalen Hurts or Saquon Barkley. All right, part of the same philosophy that we used at the beginning of the video, but now translating it over to the red zone stats. Who made the most out of the opportunities that were given? Who were given a lot of opportunities but didn't really come through on them? Let's talk about those guys. Amon-Ra St. Brown, I mean, 1st in red zone receptions, 5th in red zone targets. Again, just mentioned it a second ago. This is the type of guy that is heavily utilized in the red zone, and a lot of people really don't think about him that way. Jordan Addison, 11th in red zone targets, but up to 6th in red zone receptions. J.J. McCarthy can absolutely supply guys like Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison on a consistent basis. Nico Collins, good to see him being very successful in the red zone, even though he could probably use a few more targets. 18th in red zone targets, 9th in red zone receptions. Now keep in mind, this is a guy that also missed some time last year, still finished top 10 in red zone receptions, an absolute beast in that area. DJ Moore, Devontae Smith, and Mike Evans. These guys were 17, 17, and 16 for red zone receptions, which were good for tied for 10th and then 14th. But they were 14th in targets, 29th in targets, and 18th in targets. So all 3 of these guys saw a positive jump. It'll be interesting to see if DJ Moore will be looked at a little bit more often in the red zone this year, or if Rome Odunze, who we'll talk about here in a second, can take a step forward and help in that area. It's really interesting to see a guy like Devontae Smith being all the way up to tied for 10th in red zone receptions, especially considering the fact that his buddy, A.J. Brown and teammate, isn't anywhere near that. He's down at 14 receptions. So when you take a look at what A.J. Brown did last year for red zone targets, 24 red zone targets, which was tied for 27th, and then 14th in red zone receptions, which was tied for 17th. Devontae Smith goes 22 for 29th, 17 for 10. So Devontae Smith, a little bit better in the red zone than what A.J. Brown was, but 3 guys that need to be better in the red zone. George Pickens, 16th in red zone targets, down to 27th in red zone receptions. He's going to have to be much better this year in that area, but also he might not even see that many red zone targets. CeeDee Lamb will be utilized there. They will run the football, and then Jake Ferguson, if healthy, will also see a decent amount there. So really for me, George Pickens needs to focus on that drop issue and being a big playmaker, even if he doesn't have a whole lot of volume for Dallas this year. Rome Odunze definitely needs to get better. 13th in red zone targets, 30th in red zone receptions. He had 32 targets and only caught 10 of them in the red zone. Is that a Rome Odunze issue or a Caleb Williams issue? Ben Johnson, once again, that's an area that he's got to help out. And Marvin Harrison Jr., 30 red zone targets, which was tied for 14th, all the way down to 9 red zone receptions, which was tied for 34th. Marvin Harrison Jr. has to get better in the red zone, and he has to be stronger. I did a film evaluation a few weeks ago on Marvin Harrison Jr., and that was really the biggest thing that we saw with him. He doesn't play aggressive or strong through the catch. Unfortunately, he's getting knocked down and pushed around by some of these NFL cornerbacks. All right, the last one that we're going to touch on is going to be red zone touchdowns. We're going to make this pretty quick. Ja'Marr Chase, again, led the way. How about Terry McLaurin? Now, Terry McLaurin scored 13 receiving touchdowns last year. 12 of those came in the red zone, and those would be targets in the red zone. So it doesn't matter where Terry McLaurin was at on the field. If that target came while he was in the red zone, dude was absolutely scoring from there. And then you've got guys with double digits with Amon-Ra St. Brown, T. Higgins, Mike Evans. These are all guys that are going to be heavily utilized when you get into the red zone and you're really battling for those touchdowns. Guys that, again, in the red zone, not really being utilized, and you can see it in the touchdowns when you take a look at Demario Douglas, Khalil Shakir, Jerry Jeudy, Michael Pittman, Zay Flowers, DK Metcalf. That's the one that I think should change. Jamison Williams, Rome Odunze, I think needs to get better as well. Puka, George Pickens could get better. Wan'Dale Robinson, Josh Downs, Jacoby Myers, Calvin Ridley. You're seeing kind of the same thing here with these wide receivers, right? Like these guys that we're kind of talking about down here at the bottom of the list, outside of the 2 that I mentioned, not really red zone threats. Now, they could be. Amon-Ra St. Brown, you could say, is kind of the same build as some of these guys, but he's heavily utilized in the red zone. But unfortunately, these offenses just didn't really utilize these guys nearly as much. All right, Headliner Nation, it's time to talk about the final scores for each of these players. We took where they landed in all of these volume categories and came out with a final score. The lower the score, the better, because it means you finished higher in these categories. So you want a low score here. And we also broke it out into 4 tiers. So what wide receivers, in terms of volume, come out on top? Are you shocked to see such a low score for Amon-Ra St. Brown, especially when it came to Ja'Marr Chase being right behind him? Because people are going to argue that, oh, well, Ja'Marr Chase, the only area that he finished significantly lower in was the drop category, because that is correct. In terms of targets, Amon-Ra St. Brown and Ja'Marr Chase. St. Brown 8th, Chase 1st. Reception, St. Brown 2nd, Chase 1st. Receiving yards, St. Brown 5th, Chase 1st. Receiving touchdowns, St. Brown 3rd, Chase 1st. Red zone targets, 5th for St. Brown, 1st for Chase, 1st for St. Brown, 3rd for Chase in red zone receptions, 3rd for St. Brown, 1st for Chase in red zone touchdowns. The biggest change is the fact that Ja'Marr Chase had 10 drops, which put him at 36, where Amon-Ra St. Brown had 1 drop, which put him at 3rd. But here's the thing. The targets, even though Ja'Marr Chase did have a decent amount of more targets, even if you add a couple more drops to Amon-Ra St. Brown, he was still much lower, and that's why he was lower overall than what Ja'Marr Chase was. So drops did ultimately factor in here, but if you want to argue that regardless of what score is here, Amon-Ra St. Brown should be after Ja'Marr Chase, I get it, and I understand why. It was really one category that kind of offset things at this point. Justin Jefferson coming in at number 3, no shock there. It's good to see Drake London finish this high, and hopefully we can see him start 2025 the same way he finished 2024, where he was an absolute monster the last 3 games of the season, going with Michael Penix as the starting quarterback. Terry McLaurin, even though he didn't see a ton of volume in terms of like his targets and his receptions, he made up for it essentially everywhere else. And that's why he finishes up here in the top tier, and he will be once again for me. Garrett Wilson getting a whole lot of love. He did have a lot of volume last year. He just didn't do nearly as much with it as we would have liked. Hopefully that improves with Justin Fields. And even though I don't know if the touchdown numbers improve all that much, some of the just overall volume for targets, reception, receiving yards could be similar, if not better than last season. Cortland Sutton, he finishes very high in volume. He was the number one wide receiver there in Denver. It's going to be interesting to see with Evan Ingram there now, a little bit of an enhanced run game with RJ Harvey, and then of course some second year players that could break out and some rookies that could make an impact this year. Does Cortland Sutton see a little bit of his drop in his volume? If not, he might not be the highest upside play every single week, but he still should be safe with these numbers. Brian Thomas, Malik Neighbors, no shock seeing these guys here, rookies last season that are going to be top 10 wide receivers again. T. Higgins, even with missed time, finishes with an elite score here, puts him in the top tier of the volume category just based on a lot of the numbers alone when you take it receiving touchdowns, when you look at his drops, when you look at other things that he did. Across the board, even though he was outside the top 25 in targets and receptions because he missed time, he still finished fairly high in the rest of the categories. Devontae Adams, even though last year absolutely sucked for him when it came to quarterback play in two different areas, he was a guy, tons of volume, should still see a decent amount of volume, even with Puka this year. And JSN, good to see him finish so high in terms of volume as well. JSN is a guy that could take another step forward, being the number one wide receiver there in Seattle. Sam Darnold hopefully just plays like he did in Minnesota and doesn't go back to his New York days. All right, let's take a look at the tier 2 guys, and we start with a guy like DJ Moore, who he might not have enough to get up to the next category and be a tier 1 guy next year, and really not his fault altogether, but definitely just because of who he has around him. And it has to do with Rome Odunze for the most part. If Rome Odunze takes a really big jump, then DJ Moore could stay in this area. Even if he were to jump in his receiving yards, which is very viable, and he finished 25th there. So with a score of 25, obviously if he went up to like 15, it probably would have bumped him just over JSN. Even if we see that next year, if he loses some of the other volume and finishes outside the top 10 for like targets and receptions, that's where he could come back down a little bit. So for me, DJ Moore is still kind of a tier 2 guy. Same thing goes for like a guy like Mike Evans. He's going to have a ton of people around him this year, so I don't really expect him to be a guy that makes a huge jump going back in tier 1 in terms of volume. Tyreek Hill is a guy that is going to be interesting because when it comes to Tyreek Hill, he's been banged up. Last year, it felt like he was dealing with things off and on. He had off-season wrist surgery. And then obviously Tua's the big thing here. When Tua misses time, Tyreek Hill is just unusable. Now, maybe that changes with backup quarterbacks in Miami being this year, being a little bit more competent. But when you take a look at Tyreek Hill overall, with Tua, he probably is in the top tier. Without Tua, this is a guy that maybe falls a whole lot further, but I don't even know if Tyreek Hill wants to be in Miami right now. This dude's all over the place. CeeDee Lamb, definitely a little bit of a shock to see such a drop. One of the reasons why is because 21st in receiving touchdowns. He had 11 drops last season, which really hurt his overall score, but he wasn't heavily utilized in the red zone either. 21st, 17th, and 26th in those red zone categories. Some of it missing Dak Prescott obviously is an issue. CeeDee Lamb himself was even banged up. Now you've added George Pickens as well. I don't believe it's going to kill CeeDee Lamb's volume. He should still finish at least in this area, but with Dak Prescott healthy and CeeDee Lamb healthy all year, maybe he takes a little bit of a jump because he just sees some better overall numbers in terms of just those red zone categories, especially with George Pickens being on the outside. Jordan Addison, definitely a guy I see staying right here with Justin Jefferson being there, TJ Hawkinson. I don't think Jordan Addison is ever going to be a guy that's going to jump to that top tier volume area. Nico Collins, he could definitely jump, but a lot of it depends on how healthy he is. If it wasn't for being injured last season, he probably does finish much higher than where he's at right now. Jacoby Myers, I think, is a really solid value in this area, and he's not a guy that I'm looking at making a jump to tier 1, and maybe he's even a guy that falls just to the outside or just to the inside of tier 3 this season. Brock Bowers already gets a ton of volume, and yes, they have added some guys there to compete with Jakobi Meyers, but Jakobi Meyers to me is a solid veteran that does a lot of good things with his route running, can get himself open, and it could lead him to being somewhere in this area once again. However, I could see him dropping a little bit, but not a whole lot. Jakobi Meyers could be a really good value. A.J. Brown could go to tier 1 if he's healthy all season long. Marvin Harrison Jr., I probably see him staying right in this area. I don't think he takes a jump to tier 1. I do think some of his counting numbers are better, but receiving touchdowns were not all that bad. He didn't have a ton of drops last season. He had a decent amount of red zone targets. The thing that just overall killed him was his receptions. He was ranked 36, and then he was 34th when you took a look at red zone receptions. So those were two really the biggest areas that kept him from moving up. So can he move on and get a little bit higher towards tier 1? Absolutely. But I don't know if he's tier 1 in volume for 2025. Who are some guys in tier 3 that can make the jump to tier 2 in terms of overall volume? Is there anybody in here that goes tier 1? That's going to be fun to talk about. Juwan Jennings, no. I don't think he goes to tier 2. He was good at times last season. But when will Brandon Ayuk be back? Ricky Pearsall still there. Deebo Samuel is gone. Is Christian McCaffrey healthy? You still have George Kittle. There's still some question marks about could he see a jump in just overall volume. I don't think he makes that big of a jump. I like some of the other weapons there. I think Jennings could be safe, but not this big play guy. Ladd McConkey, I definitely can see going into tier 2. Does he make it into tier 1? I think it's possible. I think he could be a fringe guy that by the end of the season this year in 2025, we talk about him being potentially a tier 1 player in terms of volume. He is a guy with a potential huge jump ahead of him. Devontae Smith, I'm never going to put him very high in terms of volume. He has to compete, obviously, with A.J. Brown. He has to compete with Dallas Goedert. You have Saquon Barkley there. Just Devontae Smith has not been a volume guy since he's entered the league. Devontae Smith is really hard to own in redraft leagues because he's going to win you some weeks and he's going to lose you some weeks. He's a great draft in best ball leagues, absolutely. But in terms of volume, could he kind of get to tier 2? Yes, if he's healthy all year long, but he's not going to be a guy that goes much higher than that. Jerry Jeudy, if he's the number 1 wide receiver in Cleveland with improved quarterback play, really when you take a look at Jerry Jeudy, what killed him was his touchdowns and his drops. If he can reel in a few more touchdowns, if he can kind of hold on to those drops a little bit more, then this is a guy that absolutely can go into tier 2. Keenan Allen, free agent. We're not going to talk about him right now. Calvin Ridley is a guy. I still think that he's going to be more of a boomer bust play. I don't think he's going to be the volume guy anytime soon in Tennessee. They've added some weapons there. They're going to run the football. I think he's going to have some really big plays at times. And then I think there's going to be some times where, unfortunately, he's just not getting the looks. I could see him getting a few more targets, though. He was 20th with 113 targets. So I could see those pushing up towards maybe 130 a little bit more. And really the biggest name here, and one that we need to go tier 1, especially based on where he's being drafted, is Puka Nacua. Now, when you take a look across the board, a lot of this just has to do with he got banged up at one point, Cooper Kupp was banged up at one point, and was on the field at other points. 28th in targets, 19th in receptions, 23 in receiving yards, and then across the board, just his red zone stats as well were not that great. Puka Nacua, for where he's being drafted, absolutely needs to be closer to tier 1. And while I can almost bank on just give me healthy Puka Nacua, and he's easily in tier 2 last year, moving him to tier 2 is very easy at this point. But Devontae Adams is what would keep him from going into tier 1. I like Puka. I think he's going to be the volume guy there, but I definitely don't think that Devontae Adams is washed up either. Looking at the final tier now, who are the guys that absolutely deserve to be here and will continue to be here? Xavier Worthy is going to depend on Rashee Rice. If Rashee Rice plays and he is not hampered by either his injury from last year or the legal system, because that still hasn't sorted itself out, Xavier Worthy absolutely could take at least a jump to tier 3 with no Rashee Rice. Cooper Kupp, if he's healthy, he jumps into tier 3 more than likely. I don't know if he's got enough left in the tank to be a tier 2 type of player in terms of volume. And I also don't know if it's good for Seattle to make him the main target either. If JSN is going to continue to be as high as he is, really Cooper Kupp is probably capped as a tier 3 volume play. Jameson Williams, he probably remains down here. They have a lot of options there. They're going to run the football consistently with Gibbs and Montgomery. Gibbs is going to make an impact in the passing game. Amon-Ra St. Brown is the #1 target. You still have other guys there that are going to be helping out. You moved up to draft Isaac Tesla, so he's going to be kind of working on and off the field as well. Jameson Williams, great best ball play. Awesome best ball play. Redraft, it's really hard because you just don't know when he's going to have the big weeks and he's not going to have the big weeks. I know Johnny Morton is talking about the fact that Jameson Williams could see a breakout this year, and I do think we see something very similar to last season, but I really don't know if we can go a whole lot higher than that. Guys like Josh Downs, Wan'Dale Robinson, Khalil Shakir, Demario Douglas, probably are going to remain kind of in this area. Those are guys that you would take a look at more as like into the bench options that you can use on bye weeks. If you're in PPR leagues, maybe use them like in the flex, things like that. These are not guys that we're going to consistently want to start as a wide receiver 2. Now, if you play in a wide receiver 3 league, they could definitely be a part of a rotation of wide receiver 3s where if they have a really good matchup, then we would utilize them. A guy like DK Metcalf, though, in Pittsburgh, without knowing who the quarterback is still at this point, if it's Mason Rudolph, I don't think we can take him out of tier 4, which is very unfortunate. Zay Flowers, the way he started the season, he should be in tier 3, but I also think Lamar Jackson, the run game, Mark Andrews, Rashad Bateman, adding DeAndre Hopkins, Zay Flowers to me is a guy that is going to have some upside, but I think he's going to have up and down upside. When you take a look at a guy like Michael Pittman hasn't seen a ton of big playability so far. Maybe that changes with Anthony Richardson either developing a little bit more, or Daniel Jones taking over. But there's not really a ton I see here in the last tier where I'm like, yep, they for sure are going to take the next step. Realistically, though, Rome Odunze needs to take the next step. There is no reason why he should have the second lowest score on this sheet, but across the board, he just wasn't good last season. He didn't see a ton of targets, didn't have a ton of receptions, receiving yards were low. When you take a look at the top 40 in terms of targets, Rome Odunze needs to have that bump up, and no Keenan Allen is definitely going to help him get there, but he's going to have some other things go his way too for him to go much higher. Right now, for me, Rome Odunze, definitely just based on the current information, should be going into tier 3. Getting all the way up to tier 2 is going to be maybe a little bit of a stretch. I think he's definitely going to have to go over 100 targets. He's going to have to go closer to 70 receptions, and he's going to have to be in the 1,000 receiving yard range. If he can do that, then we can absolutely kind of get him in that area. But we're going to need some things to go right for him as well. And when you take a look at this sheet in terms of guys that just had the most targets, and does that just automatically equal good volume? Well, when you take a look at it, Terry McLaurin, outside the top 10 in targets, finished as a tier 1 player. Cortland Sutton and Brian Thomas Jr. both finished outside the top 10 in targets, tier 1 player. T. Higgins finished 27th in targets, tier 1 player. Devontae Adams was at 10th, tier 1. Jackson Smith-Njigba was at 11th, tier 1. Now, when you take a look at some guys who had the biggest falls, DJ Moore was 9th in targets, tier 2 player. CeeDee Lamb 6th in targets, tier 2 player. Jerry Jeudy 7th in targets, tier 3 player. So those guys that are inside the top 10 in targets, while that's great, it doesn't necessarily mean that the volume is going to be great across the board. And hopefully this video could help you understand that a little bit. But who are the biggest risers and the biggest fallers from 2023 to 2024? Taking a look at the video that I did last year compared to this year for each of the last 2 seasons. Our biggest jump was Drake London. His score went up 19 points. Terry McLaurin went up 11.85 points. Jamar Chase went up 8 points. Garrett Wilson and Amon-Ra St. Brown also had positive gains. But there were way more negative gains than there were positive from the last year. Devontae Smith, his score drops a point. Jordan Addison, his score drops 2 points. Nico Collins dropped 2 points. George Pickens dropped 2 points. The biggest fallers, though, CeeDee Lamb dropped 16.43 points. His rank last season was 1.57. The best rank this year was Amon-Ra St. Brown at 3.37. That's insane. That's insane. That is an awful drop, and CeeDee Lamb hopefully will get back on track, because if he can, then he'll be well worth the pick. And I'm not giving up on him. Dak's got to be healthy, and I think having George Pickens will help for the most part. Hopefully he doesn't lose a ton of volume, but realistically, CeeDee Lamb, even though the numbers were not bad last season, he definitely was not nearly as good as he could have or should have been. But Headliner Nation, hopefully you have enjoyed the first 2 videos of this series. Running backs yesterday, wide receivers today for volume monsters. My next video will be tight end volume monsters, and then it's on to insane efficiency, covering running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends there as well. If you're new here to the channel, you need to subscribe. You're not going to want to miss any of this information that we'll be covering over the next couple of weeks. If you're new here, or if you've been here for a while and your bell notifications are not on, please turn those on right now. You don't want to miss anything that we're doing here. And hit the like button as well. Let us know that you're appreciating the content that we are putting out. And don't forget to order your draft guide at the link down below. I hope everybody has a safe and healthy Memorial Day weekend. And I'll see you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliner.